Who do you think was the most powerful woman in history? You might think of the queens of England, or perhaps other European queens, but none of those are the correct answer. The most powerful woman in history was an Egyptian queen and the last pharaoh of Egypt. A woman who, to maintain power, not only married her own brother, but also formed calculated romantic relationships with many Roman generals and powerful men of her time. This is what made Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful woman in history. Disclaimer: this video may include imagery, archival footage, or descriptions that might not be suitable for all audiences. While every effort has been made to present the content in an educational and respectful manner, some scenes may be considered disturbing or inappropriate for certain viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The first thing we need to know about Cleopatra is that she wasn't actually Egyptian by origin. Her ancestry traces back to Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's commanders. After Alexander's death, the region of Egypt was allocated to this commander. When Ptolemy, who is in fact Cleopatra's ancestor, came to power in Egypt, he quickly realized that in this part of the world, neither democracy, nor a republic, nor any form of government used in Europe would work. Therefore, Ptolemy concluded that he had to set aside everything he had learned about governing and instead try to rule the Egyptians according to their own culture. So in a brilliant strategic move, he declared himself the Pharaoh of Egypt. This allowed him to rule Egypt firmly and powerfully for many years. Why? Because the Egyptian people no longer saw him as a foreigner seeking to dominate them, but as an Egyptian pharaoh whose commands they had to obey. And that is why the Ptolemaic dynasty was able to easily rule over Egypt for about 300 years. Thus, we understand here that Cleopatra was ethnically Greek and had virtually no connection to the Egyptians by blood. Cleopatra was born in an era when her family's dynasty was collapsing, and the Romans were even casting a covetous eye on conquering Egypt. However, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, saw something in his daughter's gaze that gave him hope. He knew perfectly well that she was no ordinary girl. From childhood, it was clear that she possessed both immense intelligence and a pure, unyielding ambition. Even in her childhood games, Cleopatra hated to lose and would use any means necessary to win. To all these traits, we must also add her unparalleled beauty, which meant that she could influence people not only with her intelligence and charismatic words, but would first captivate anyone she met with her beauty. From a young age, Cleopatra underwent rigorous training in philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and foreign languages, to the extent that she could fluently speak 9 languages, including Egyptian, Latin, and Middle Persian. Therefore, upon her father's death, he named her as his successor. However, at that time, especially in Egypt, it was completely unacceptable for a woman to be a queen or ruler, let alone the pharaoh of Egypt. And this is precisely where the story of Cleopatra's intelligence and seductive power begins. During this period, when the country was in turmoil, and the people were not receptive to a female pharaoh, many Egyptian nobles wanted to make Cleopatra's 10-year-old brother the pharaoh and her father's successor. Using her great intelligence, Cleopatra grew very close to her brother. With her seductive actions and charismatic speech, at which she was a master, she influenced him to such an extent that she not only made him understand that her position was superior to his, but she also married her 10-year-old brother to silence the surrounding courtiers and nobles. And so, this forced the Egyptian nobles, who until then had believed that a woman could not be the lawgiver and pharaoh of Egypt, to have no choice but to accept Cleopatra as the 7th pharaoh of Egypt, now that they saw a man by her side as her husband. It was at this point that Cleopatra's power grew stronger every day. to the point that she even ordered her brother's name to be removed from most official documents. If you are wondering why, the answer is that in the past, royals did not have good relationships with one another. The relationship between Cleopatra and her husband, her younger brother, was not only poor, but she was constantly thinking of how to eliminate him. During this period, many believe that the real power in Egypt was mostly in the hands of the Egyptian nobles, not Cleopatra and her brother. For this reason, there are stories about how coins came to be minted with Cleopatra's face on them. One of these stories claims that Cleopatra had a great desire for Egyptian coins to be minted with her face on them. However, this was a move that was popular neither with the Egyptian people nor the nobles. For this reason, Cleopatra went to the chambers of two of the most influential nobles at night. Through the relationship she formed with them, she persuaded them to mint the Egyptian coins with her face. After some time had passed, not only did the people of Egypt fail to get used to Cleopatra, but the Egyptian nobles also abandoned her. With the help of Cleopatra's younger brother, they planned a conspiracy against her. But as I mentioned before, Cleopatra was very intelligent and quickly learned of this plot, so she fled from Egypt. She ceded the throne to her younger brother and husband, Ptolemy XIII. It was during this time that in Rome, which was arguably the region's foremost power, a conflict broke out between two great generals, a war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. During this conflict, Pompey fled to Egypt, and Julius Caesar pursued him. It was at this moment that Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's husband, decided to kill Pompey and present him as a gift to Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, Ptolemy XIII presented him with Pompey's severed head. This demonstrates that, unlike Cleopatra, her brother was not at all intelligent. Why? Because Julius Caesar was enraged by Ptolemy's actions. The reason was that, at the time, Roman generals considered themselves a much superior race and could not accept that even their enemy would be killed by a foreign Egyptian force. Naturally, Julius Caesar had expected the pharaoh of Egypt to hand Pompey over to him, not to punish and kill him himself. And it was precisely here that an opportunity arose for Cleopatra. She could leverage Julius Caesar's anger toward her brother to form an alliance with him and once again become the supreme power in Egypt. So Cleopatra, who was effectively a fugitive at this point, returned to Egypt and secretly made her way into Julius Caesar's chambers. Here we must consider why one of the most powerful generals in history, Julius Caesar, would agree to form an alliance with a fugitive Egyptian princess, going against the wishes of both the Egyptian nobles and the people. And it is precisely at this point that Cleopatra's beauty and skills of seduction came to her aid. That night, Cleopatra provided Julius Caesar with an unforgettable night of passion, and this led Caesar to declare his full support for the fugitive Egyptian princess. When the Egyptian nobles realized that their 21-year-old fugitive princess had returned to Egypt through the sheer seduction of the most powerful Roman general of the time, the 52-year-old Julius Caesar, they made the wise decision. Instead of confronting Julius Caesar's lover, they treated her with respect. It was then that Cleopatra once again became the supreme power in Egypt. And who would dare to challenge the word of Julius Caesar's mistress? Some time passed, and Cleopatra's husband, her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, was the only one who could not come to terms with this situation in any way. Therefore, just as before, he rose up in rebellion against Cleopatra. Ptolemy thought that just like before, he could overthrow his sister with the help of his loyalists and the Egyptian nobles, and once again become the supreme ruler of Egypt. But, as we've mentioned, In terms of intelligence, he was no match for his sister, and this led him to act on this illogical decision. Ptolemy's soldiers, who had advanced as far as the walls of Cleopatra's fortress, felt they were just a few steps away from another successful rebellion. However, any rational person knew that this time was completely different from the last, because this time, Ptolemy wasn't just rebelling against his sister, he was rebelling against his own wife, who was the mistress of Julius Caesar. And this led Julius Caesar's army, summoned by a letter from Cleopatra, to enter Egypt. They not only crushed Ptolemy's rebellion, but also drowned Ptolemy himself in the Nile River. This time, Julius Caesar showed that he would show no mercy even to Cleopatra's own husband, and that anyone who tried to harm his mistress would have to say goodbye to this world. So any rational person could see that at that time, the supreme power in Egypt was Queen Cleopatra. And since this woman was highly intelligent, she decided to have a child with Julius Caesar so she could use this as leverage to transform her status from Caesar's mistress to his wife. As we know with Cleopatra, this woman gets whatever she wants, so she soon had a child by Julius Caesar. At this point, Cleopatra's power multiplied. She was not only the queen of Egypt, but also became a god to the Egyptians. Because in Egyptian culture, the pharaoh is typically worshipped, they accepted Cleopatra as the goddess of tears, a deity who fills the Nile River with her tears. So now Cleopatra was accepted by the people, the nobles of Egypt, and the greatest foreign power, Rome. At this point in the story, it can be said that Cleopatra was in the best period of her life. But good times don't last forever, and like any other story, Cleopatra's story had to face its own challenges. So one day, as our beautiful queen was playing with her young son, she received news that Julius Caesar, her greatest supporter, had been killed in a coup in Rome. It was at this moment that Cleopatra's world came crashing down. At this point in the story, Cleopatra, sensing that her other, younger brother might become a problem and try to seize power now that Julius Caesar was dead, ordered the 15-year-old teenager's assassination. This angered the Egyptian people and nobles, and Egypt was no longer a very safe place for her. To control the anger of the nobles and the people, Cleopatra named her own son Ptolemy XV, so that a man's name would continue to be seen alongside hers. However, just as a man's name had always been beside hers while she was the one truly in charge, everyone knew things were going to continue the same way. The pressure on Cleopatra was at its greatest during this time, but she was not a woman who would surrender. For this reason, she decided to travel to the Mediterranean coast to meet with one of Julius Caesar's successors. But what kind of meeting? Exactly the kind we have all come to expect from Cleopatra. A meeting where Cleopatra, with her radiant skin, unparalleled beauty, and seductive physical movements and body language, caused Mark Antony, Caesar's successor, to also become strangely captivated by her. It is said that after this meeting, Mark Antony told his friends that no woman had ever been able to satisfy his manly desires the way Cleopatra had. Now, Cleopatra had once again managed to secure the power of one of the greatest Roman men for herself. With this move, she not only re-established her dominance over Egypt, but also created one of the greatest love stories in history alongside Mark Antony. Cleopatra did exactly with Mark Antony what she had done with Julius Caesar. She quickly became pregnant by him. At this point in the story, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were enjoying a happy period together. However, like other good times, this period also passed quickly. Mark Antony made one of the worst decisions of his life. And what was that decision? To attack the Parthian Empire in Persia. While it was true that Rome was immensely powerful at the time, this was a bite bigger than Antony could chew. It was in this campaign that Cleopatra and Antony experienced their greatest military defeat, and their army suffered irreparable losses. Not only did they fail to conquer Persian territory, but the attack also severely weakened the forces under Antony's command. Meanwhile, Antony's rival, Octavian, was in Rome, far from the war, equipping the forces under his own command. And now Octavian, who saw Mark Antony as a general defeated by the war with Persia, decided to persuade the Roman Senate to launch an attack on Egypt, led by Octavian himself. Although Mark Antony was also a Roman general, the Roman people did not accept his relationship with Cleopatra, as she was his mistress, while his actual wife and children lived in Rome. For the Roman elite, it was intolerable that Antony would oppose a decision to attack Egypt. But just as we might guess, Cleopatra's power of seduction and beauty influenced Antony, causing him to declare his support for Egypt and Cleopatra in this conflict, which amounted to treason against his own country, Rome. Numerous battles broke out between Rome and the army of Cleopatra and Antony. In this war, the army of Antony and Egypt suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Roman army and Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra were forced to retreat to their last point of resistance, Alexandria. It was here that Cleopatra realized her lover, Antony, was defeated and no longer the powerful man he once. She decided to use her own methods once again, by forming a relationship with Octavian, who was effectively Egypt's main enemy and, more importantly, the primary foe of her current lover, Mark Antony. She hoped to regain power. So, she beautified herself, sent all the jewels she had to Octavian, and wrote him a letter saying she would like to spend a night with him. However, unlike Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, Octavian was not a man driven by lust, and it was clear he would not sacrifice all of Rome for one woman. It was here that Cleopatra realized the schemes she had always used to gain power did not always work. Effectively, Cleopatra had to accept defeat. But defeat was something this woman would never kneel before. So, she decided to go to her luxurious chamber and commit suicide by drinking a cup of poison. Mark Antony, upon learning this news, and more importantly, learning that in her final efforts Cleopatra had even tried to form a relationship with Octavian, could not control himself and committed suicide by plunging a dagger into his own heart. Many believe that Cleopatra did not commit suicide with a cup of poison, but by allowing a snake to bite her. In any case, this was the end of the most powerful woman in history. But the main question is this: were her successes a result of her intelligence and cleverness, or her use of beauty and feminine seduction? Please answer in the comments.